Hello, I'm David Beatson, sitting in for Mandy McLeod. Welcome to Straight Talk. And coming up in the program, boost or blast? How's that new budget going to hit the farm gate? And what about Labor's alternatives? Dairy debt. Have we got a big bad bubble ready to burst? Freshwater, fact or fantasy? And will that new freshwater strategy really make a difference in 100% pure New Zealand? Well, joining me for this edition of Straight Talk, we've got Philip York, who is the Commerce and Economics spokesperson for Federated Farmers, and Anne Boniface, who is the senior economist at Westpac Bank. Now, Philip, you're on record as giving the briefest summation of the budget I've seen. One word: boring. Why?
Well, it was hardly stupendous. I mean, I think it's going in the right direction there, but there's still a lot can be done. Was
it boring because it was flagged? So much was spilled, dripped, conditioned in advance?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that a lot of it, and in fact, when you look at it, there's not actually a huge amount of stuff in there.
Okay, and you've heard it. He says boring, and then there are a few positives in there. What's your reading?
I think it was a very conservative budget. It took a little bit off a lot of large programs rather than wiping one program to a large extent. So conservative in that approach. Probably what it didn't do over a long term is think about what's going to happen with New Zealand's ageing population. So it gave some indication that it was looking to cut expenses, but with New Zealand's baby boomers getting older, we're going to increasingly have to spend a greater proportion of what we earn on healthcare and pension costs.
Were you really expecting anything from for the agriculture sector? I mean, largest industry in the country.
Well, no,
you've given up.
We never expect anything. What we'd like is government to sort of get out of our lives and reduce their costs. And in that way, in fact, it's sort of, as far as core government expenditure was concerned, then in fact, I don't think it went far enough at all. But as far as KiwiSaver, for example, I was expecting the whole amount of the subsidy to go, and I think that it should have done.
And the kickstart too.
And the kickstart as well.
I mean, they have been clearly burning some political capital. That move on KiwiSaver, screwing down working for families, tightening up student loans, those are moves that the Federation actually advocated. What are you moaning about?
Well, as the fact that they just didn't go far enough. I think that you say they're burning political capital, but government should always do the right thing. They shouldn't always be looking over their shoulder immediately. I think it's quite an opportunity when you go into government for 3 years to be able to do what you believe is right. And I believe that it's all about expedience and looking for the next election.
Well, there's a second leg to come, I think. Bill English, I've spoken to, he indicated that to me. Are you expecting a second leg before the election?
Well, I look forward to it with bated breath.
Anne, how about you? Do you think there's more to come?
Well, it is an election year, and election years are often full of surprises, so you never know. But again, I don't know either.
I wonder, Philip, if you're really being fair, and I want your help on this. There's been some big-ticket items that have been in the pipeline that are going to start paying off, like the boost in infrastructure funding, the new road and rail capability, which is funded in the budget, the big ultra-fast broadband rollout. They're being flagged, but is he sort of playing down, if you like, the benefit that will come in efficiency gains from that area?
I think there are certainly benefits to the agricultural sector from government investment in infrastructure, because it's setting the background and allowing farmers to do what they do best. So it's giving them the tools to carry out their day-to-day business. It's important to remember it's not about what goes in, but it's about what comes out. So as long as that investment is done efficiently, then it's about getting the best value for money from that investment.
Oh, okay. No, do you take the point? Well, aren't you being a bit unfair when you dismiss it as boring, when you consider those big-ticket items that have been sustained right through global recession, finance sector meltdown, and 2 Canterbury earthquakes? Come on.
Well, I could take the earthquakes into account because they in fact was something that they certainly didn't expect. But no, in reality, I think that obviously borrowing for infrastructure improvement is good, but the continuous borrowing, a lot of borrowing is done just to take the hard edge off the recession. Well, in effect, this country needed to have a recession at that particular time.
We've got $1 billion worth going to be cut out of the state sector, and that's on top of a whole lot of trimming that's been going on so far. I mean, that's a heck of a lot of money. I don't know quite how much more you can cut.
Well,
you think more. Come on.
I honestly think as long as we're continuing to borrow at this rate. So, see, the borrowing the money has been quite difficult for farmers because, in effect, it's kept the dollar high. We when the overseas exchange we earn comes in, that sort of sets a level, supply and demand. But when the government borrows, it puts an extra one on that. In fact, when we went through during that particular period when the dollar should have actually been quite low, it was high because the government continued to borrow. The government actually made life quite difficult for our farmers.
Well, the budget is an election year budget, and we're seeing some interesting developments come out of the Labor Party. I know what he's going to say, but Anne, what do you think? The moves that have been said, raise the minimum wage, look at bringing farmers into the emissions trading scheme 2 years earlier than previously scheduled. What's your reading on that?
Sure. Well, bringing farmers into the emissions trading scheme 2 years earlier essentially only provides enough funding to fund the research and development tax credits that Labor's talking about for 5 years. So after that period finishes, they're going to have to come up with a plan B of how further funding of that program is going to be done.
Okay, so we haven't seen the full funding impact there.
Not necessarily.
We are not covered, despite the fact that you were saying this is the last thing that anybody should be doing right now, right?
Well, I heard the term this morning, voodoo economics, and I think that...
you didn't invent that, did you?
No, I didn't. I actually heard it, I think. And if I did give credit to anybody, it's Stephen Joyce. And in effect, I think that that's what the case is. I mean, in effect, Labor have said that they don't want the farming vote.
But I'm sorry, these emissions trading scheme prescriptions require somebody to pay for the emissions created by farmers. You're saying farmers shouldn't, but if you don't, taxpayers do. Is that a fair deal?
Is there any way that you can reduce your methane emissions without actually reducing the number of stock which actually drive the economy? The whole thing actually is a scam, and as such should be proved to be a thing. The fact we signed Kyoto and means that we actually need to pay this money, well, I don't perceive it as being farmers' problems.
Well, let's pause there. Coming up, dairy debt. Export prices are at a record high, but so is dairy sector debt. Reserve Bank Governor Alan Bollard is worried. So what's going to happen? Stay with us. Welcome back to Straight Talk. The average Kiwi dairy farm is in hock to the bank to the tune of about $2.8 million. How bad is that? Well, bad enough for the Reserve Bank to say some banks were overstretched and very lucky that dairy prices really took a jump over the last 18 months. The central bank is now lifting the level of capital that trading banks need to hold to support that farm lending. And Anne, I guess that sounds like there's a bit of tightening up going to go.
Well, that remains to be seen, really. The action by the Reserve Bank has been quite well signalled. So it's been talking about this move for quite some time. Banks may well have moved already in anticipation of this change of rules by the Reserve Bank.
Yeah, but I mean, if they're saying you've got to have more capital that you're holding, either you've got to get it from depositors or presumably you've got to raise it in some other way. If you don't do that, then you're not going to have money to lend.
Absolutely, and that's what banks have been doing.
Is there a big adjustment required to meet the new prudential levels that the Reserve Bank is setting?
Well, for prudential regulation as a whole, banks are holding well over the amount of capital required by the Reserve Bank.
Okay. So, I mean, you wouldn't want to see any tighter lending.
No, but
I mean, the banks might have a different view.
Possibly, but I think the $2.8 million they've got with the dairy farmers, I think, is probably quite a good investment as far as these guys are concerned.
Yeah, but I mean, the industry as a whole is pretty deep in debt. There's some, you talk about 2.8 million per farm.
The average can hide quite marked changes and differences between individual farmers. So the Reserve Bank has also pointed out that a large number of farmers actually have very modest levels of debt, and a few have a large amount.
20% of our most important industry may be in the do, is what you're really saying, not 100%.
Well, they're only in the do if they can't pay the interest rates and the capital back. So, in effect, as I say, I think it's the fact that the banks have got this amount of money. I think in most cases now, particularly the prices have increased and stabilised, then they're probably thinking it's quite a reasonable investment to have with farmers.
Yeah, but do you honestly think that a typical farm, $2.8 million, is a reasonable debt load?
I've been above that and I've paid it off.
Okay. You did it. Will the 20% who are in strain at the moment do it?
I honestly have great belief in these farmers, and I'm sure that the banks are supporting them and looking after them well. There may be an odd few cases that got a little bit overextended, but in effect, if the prices that they are continue and people don't come and tickle our pockets all the time to try and get
I'll come back to that in a minute or two, because they're certainly going to try.
Well, then in effect, I think it's quite viable.
Okay, I mean, one of the things that is going on is that behind the scenes, Peter Dunn is looking at tightening up a couple of areas of tax, isn't he? He's talking about fringe benefit tax, and he's also been talking about how livestock valuation methodology can be used to minimise tax. What's your reading on those points? Is that likely to produce some significant change?
I don't believe it will be major. I think there's been a few anomalies, and as such, Peter Dunn indicated to us quite a while that he was going to look at changing them. They're investigating the best way to do it at the moment, and I think that in effect it won't have much effect at all on the industry. Some people probably say paying a bit of tax when they work to the legal system. There's nothing illegal done. I think that if there is any changes, our guys won't be too unhappy about it. I think it'll just be a normal part of how a sovereign government collects its revenue.
Yeah, but bluntly, have farmers actually been milking the taxman by playing one tax treatment of their livestock against another, switching from one to the other as market circumstances favour that change?
I think there's been a few cases where people have done that, but in effect they've just been dealing with the normal requirements that they were allowed to do under the current system. Well, if the system changes, taxation systems change all the time, and as such, well, I think that this is it's a bit of a red herring, actually.
And I read in the paper recently that your bank is actually looking for opportunities in the dairy sector. When I look at those figures that have been trotted out, that Labor trotted out, paying just $1,500 in tax, a dairy farmer paying $1,500 in tax compared to a couple of pensioners paying $3,000. Doesn't look too good an industry if it can be that bad and maybe that good within the space of 2 years. It's very volatile. What makes it attractive to bankers?
Well, each loan agreement is on an individual case-by-case basis. So if the bank's satisfied that farmers will be able to repay the loan and they've got the security to service it, then they're happy to lend, I think. Okay,
but I mean, do you have many of the farm borrowers who you are watching or managing? Because I saw another story which suggested that there were a significant number of farmers who were being managed by their banks rather than see a farm sale or a farm put through.
Sure, I think that banks in general will certainly help their customers wherever possible. They don't want to see farms foreclosed on by any stretch of the imagination.
Have we got a situation where we've got an accurate grip on what the actual farm values are that are being borrowed against? Because there haven't been a lot of, say, dairy farm sales recently to indicate what the general values really are.
So, I work on the principle that at the moment, if you're making money from your investment, well, why would you want to sell your property? I mean, the only people who may need to sell because they've got into trouble, or people who are moving along their natural progression as far as their age is concerned. But I would think if people should be out there wanting to buy dairy farms rather than sell them at the moment, and as such, people should not want to sell them.
Well, there are clearly a few Germans and Chinese who want to buy dairy farms. But Anne, I come back to that question. Do you have a real good grip on the true values of dairy farms in particular?
I think with such a low volume of sales going through it, it's more difficult than normal to estimate how much a farm is worth, for sure. And I think there's probably still a little bit of a disconnect between what sellers want to get for their property and what buyers are willing to pay.
Okay, quick change of tack. The government got a tick from the credit rating agencies for the budget, but I see that the major Australian-owned banks got a rating downgrade, and yours in New Zealand is still to come. How's that going to affect things?
So the Australian banks were downgraded, and there was actually very little reaction in markets to that. There's two reasons for that.
Well, I just saw $9 billion wiped off the share values of the four major trading banks. That must have some effect.
It did have some effect, but it wasn't as big an effect as what you might have expected if this news was completely coming out of the blue.
And I think some of that was due to international economic conditions with the fragility in Europe, quite frankly, looking at what was going on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, surely it can have a significant effect if the credit ratings of those banks do get affected, it will flow on sooner or later, won't it?
Well, it's shareholder capital gone anyway, so it's in effect the shareholders will take the problem with that. But I think that the banks are pretty sound in the Antipodes.
The banks are sound, yes, okay, but I'm saying, will they have to get sounder, and will that be at the expense of people on the land who want to borrow?
I think a lot of people are repaying debt at the moment, and in fact, my concern would be the banks would end up with a too cash flush, and they would wanting to try and get rid of it as cash in the bank, as far as these guys are concerned, doesn't actually pay it. They've got to get it out there and get people paying interest on it, and a little bit of a concern about the 5% deposit rates, I must admit.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one area of concern already. So, however, the banks are intensely competitive in the marketplace, and I wonder if that's if they're competitive enough in a market like New Zealand for that to have a tempering effect, or do you guys just shadow each other?
I think that banks are genuinely competitive in the New Zealand market, and I don't think there's too many questions about that.
Okay.
Could I just return to you were talking about the fact that the article in certain paper about the farmers don't pay tax. You've just got to bear in mind, and we're talking here to probably a rural audience, and these guys are the genesis of most of the tax paid in this country. Now, in effect, a lot of the times they haven't been able to make a profit, and in that particular year that guy was talking about, they all made a loss, so therefore they didn't pay income tax, or lots of it, but they are the genesis of all the income tax, or all the tax paid in this country, really, by being the primary industry.
I'm going to come back to that. And coming up, fresh water, how pure is it? And how's the new nationwide policy statement on fresh water going to help? We've got more Straight Talk to come. And will our panel members opt for a rant or a rave? Stay tuned. Welcome back to Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. Well, John Key got himself into a tangle on British television when the hard-nosed host of that program, Hard Talk, took him to task over the level of water pollution in the land that boasts it's 100% pure. Take a quick look at it.
Your advertising slogan, I think, was all about this, about the 100% pure New Zealand, the idea that you're a greener nation than any other in the developed world. That already isn't true as your population does slowly rise, and it's going to get worse. Dr. Mike Joy of Massey University, a leading environmental scientist in your country, said just the other day, he said, we are delusional about how clean and green we are.
Well, that might be Mike Joy's view, but I don't share that view.
But he is very well qualified, isn't he? And he's looked, for example, at the number of species threatened with extinction in New Zealand. He's looked at the fact that half your lakes, 90% of your lowland rivers are now classed as polluted.
Well, look, I'd hate to get into a flaming row with one of our academics, but he's offering his view. I think any person that goes down to New Zealand...
He's a scientist, it's based on research. It's not just an opinion
he's one
from the
academic,
air.
and like lawyers, I could provide you another one that will give you a counter view.
Okay, John Key, 100% or what? I wonder, however, about that clean, green, 100% pure label, the brand that New Zealand has been emblazoned with. Does it have real value for the agriculture sector? I mean, is it a measurable, or are we actually creating a problem for ourselves, setting the bar too high?
I think it's a good aspirational goal for all sectors, not just the agricultural sector, but in general to strive for that kind of pure green image provides you with opportunities as an exporter.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised, Phil, that the Prime Minister didn't dodge around the fact that actually we've modified it from 100% pure New Zealand to 100% pure you. I wonder what... Okay, but I mean, you take my point. Is this going, it looks like everybody's going to start whacking us around the ears offshore, saying you claim to be 100% pure, but you're not.
Being the old cynic that I am, I haven't liked this for a long time. It's very difficult to get 100%. I mean, are we talking about that all our lakes are going to be distilled water? No, they're not, because it's coming down out of the bush, and there's possums in there, and there's wild pigs and this stuff, and it's sort of in effect, we live in an environment that is pretty good as far as anywhere in the world is concerned. And I've seen lots of places that would turn your stomach compared to our beautiful country.
Yeah, but at the same time, we know that water standards are deteriorating, and we've got a situation where water itself is becoming a relatively scarce commodity in New Zealand. Are we treasuring it enough, Anne?
I think we're moving down the right path, but I think that you're right, it is a scarce resource, and the pull on that resource is only going to increase with time. So it's going to become an even more important issue than it is now in the future.
Okay, we've now got a new national policy statement on fresh water. Is that going to help, or is it just a nice set of words?
Again, it's a good movement in the right direction. But what we need now, after all this talk, is more integration with different government agencies and regional councils, and greater clearer allocation of water rights, just who can trade water rights and what the value of them is.
So we didn't get too far down the road on that kind of question in the actual policy statement. We've got more work to do.
Well, we've got to get out there and get more storage. I mean, we've got all this water in New Zealand, and it's such, it all falls on it. Well, 97% of it actually runs out of the country, and we should... In fact, there's as much water runs out of New Zealand as out of the total area of Australia. And as such, we should be collecting that water and storing it for future use.
Yeah, well, I'd like to come back to how we use it, because when you look at the latest report from Environment Southland, they checked 54 farms. Half of them, nearly half of them this month, were seriously in breach of their effluent discharge consents. Now, that sounds like a reason for lifting the game to me.
You know, I've sort of inquired about that, and I think a lot of it was actually about farm tracks, and they've sort of brought farm tracks into it.
Yeah.
Any runoff from the farm track is now sort of been monitored, and that in itself is a new thing. And a lot of farmers weren't aware of it, so therefore, in effect, they failed. But I was sitting next to the CEO of Environment Southland a couple of days ago, and he was telling me that. He didn't really consider it to be a huge problem. It's all solvable, and there is the potential for another 500 dairy farms in Southland, and as such, then these guys are just going to have to stay at the top of their game.
And one of the things that's in the budget is there's some seed funding for investigation of opportunities for irrigation, and presumably your dams will get caught up in this process with the possibility of an investment of $400 million. The government at least prepared to consider it. Now, does $400 million actually translate to a lot of farm production? Or is it a quality lift?
It's $400 million combined with some contribution from the private sector as well. So depending on what extent that generates that private sector contribution, you could see quite a wide range of outcomes.
Okay, but is there any work done to indicate if you put in $400 million, you're going to get X amount of increased productivity or X amount of productive land brought into farming?
I can't quote the actual source or anything like that, but the figures that I've seen show that there is a huge potential from investment in that. Probably far more than anything else in the country at the moment, I would say.
I'd like to come back, however, to this question of the contest for the resource, because it will seem to me that there will always be probably more demand than we currently have, even if we do go into a significant construction program for irrigation schemes. And allocation, I mean, at the moment it's really pretty well first come, first served. Are we going to have to start really putting values on the water resource that people use as opposed to first come, first served draw?
Absolutely. First come, first served won't work in the future, and it's only just working now. People who don't need too much water are using too much, and people who can't get hold of enough who need more.
Okay.
I'd go back to the fact that we just got to increase the resource. If the resource is there in plentiful, then there is not going to be a huge competition for it.
So there's $400 million scope coming,
well,
maybe,
it's
if you guys can make it.
It's a start.
Okay, let's take a break for a quick rant or rave. What is it about the rural sector that's got your blood boiling this week, Philip?
I spent quite a lot of last week dealing with Professor Bob Carter from the University of Townsville, and he in effect he's a major contra when it comes to anthropogenic global warming, and as such he was found impossible to get into the media when James Hansen was wandering around.
So
I think
human impacts on climate warming, please, anthropogenic. I know exactly what you mean. Okay.
But You would know that as far as the media are concerned, it's just got to the stage
sorry.
where we have a huge problem in getting the alternative
We're
view
dealing
put
with
across.
theology here, not science.
Well, we are. It is
Okay.
theology.
Anne, a rant or rave?
Rave for me. I think this week's news about Fonterra's payout above $8 for the current season potentially, and looking at an above $7 payout for next season is great news for dairy farmers, not only for what it means for this season's income, but also for what it means for the world's demanding more of our goods and are willing to pay for it.
Thanks, Anne. Well, mine's a rant. If you're going to take a shot at dairy farmers over the amount of tax they pay, get your facts right, particularly if you're the Labour Party's revenue spokesman like Stuart Nash. Stuart, next time use figures from the same year for your comparisons, and don't forget, business expenses have to be deducted from income before you work out tax liability. Talk about Townie of 2011. Well, that's it for this edition of Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Foreign. I'd like to thank my guests, Philip York and Anne Boniface. I'll be back in the chair next week with more Straight Talk.